Hey, what's up everyone? Today I'm going to be working on this medium-sized Japanese black pine. It was purchased from me by a client a number of years ago, I believe in 2018, so it's been 3 years out of my care, and now I've got it back. So I'm going to take another look at it, see if I can get it cleaned up and prepare it for potentially being entered into the Pacific Bonsai Expo. All right, well, let me just give this a little bit of a spin. I've got it propped up here so that I can do a little bit of an angle change. And as a result of the angle change, I'm also gonna have to wire and bring down some of these branches in the back in order to basically reduce the length in the back and also round out the crown, because right now the tree looks bigger than it should because the point of the top maybe should be here, but these branches are actually higher than the branches that are right here. So there's a really nice short crop of needles on here that the current owner managed to create after decandling over the summer. So it's obviously been decandled. And then they've gone through and done some needle thinning. And so the first step, I'm just going to kind of orient myself as to the condition of the different branches by going through and checking the needle pulling. And then also there's some aluminum wire on here, which I'm actually going to take off in favor of using copper wire in order to wire the entire tree. As I'm going through this, I'm noticing a couple of issues that are the result of doing the work maybe a little bit too quickly or without quite enough training. And so let me just point out a couple of them. First, there are needles here that have been broken. And in other words, so there's a nice green fresh needle here that was grown on a summer bud, and then in the middle of that needle is like a brown spot, and the needle is bent sideways. So whenever you're approaching a black pine with your hand, if you're going to go in and do the needle pulling using two fingertips like this rather than a pair of tweezers, you can't put your hand into a pine like this. You have to think of a pine as a pincushion. So if you put your hand in here, maybe you think, oh, that doesn't really hurt very much like it would if it was actually a pincushion, but it will hurt the needles, especially if they're not completely hardened off. And this is a common issue that we see with people who have not worked with black pines quite as much as I have maybe. So take your hand, and instead of going like this, you need to bring your hand up from underneath in order to pick those needles. So you just kind of think of the whole thing as a one-way street. Whenever you go to put your hand in, your hand should first approach from the bottom and then go up through the needles, because that way you won't be bending any of them over. So another issue that I'm looking at here is the fall thinning involves removing needles, and it involves thinning back clusters of buds. So the result of the summer decandling is usually between 2 and 5 buds at a given location. And when you go in and pull needles, you can do it a number of different ways. So if I pull a needle off from grabbing the tip of the needle and just pulling outwards, I'll pull that needle off, but I've left the sheath here. And there's not really a horticultural issue with the sheath being left on, but it does just make the tree look kind of messy. They'll fall off after maybe a couple of months, but for the sake of doing nice clean work, what I prefer to do is either grab the needles by the base so that you're pulling the sheath off with the needle, or use a pair of tweezers to do the same thing, so that you get a nice clean twig. That not only makes the branch look cleaner, but it also makes it so that you have nothing kind of clumping under the wire when you go to wire it afterwards. In addition, a lot of times, and it's not uniform, but a lot of times black pines will have bracts, B-R-A-C-T-S, and those are these sorts of little formations that happen. It's kind of like juvenile growth on the pine. Those basically will turn brown as soon as the new needles come out, and so as part of a cleanup of the tree, to just make it look as pretty and clean as possible, I would tend to be picking off the bracts at the same time that I'm pulling needles to give a nice clean look without any brown showing. It actually looks very much like a juniper needle on like a needle juniper, or a juniper that's gone juvenile. I've got about half of this wired. You can see that this whole section down here, I've bent down the growth in order to kind of spread it out. I've also done a fair amount of thinning and just sort of cut back in areas where I could in order to shorten branches and to reduce the overall volume, because this is way more volume than we want for the size of the trunk that we have here. So I want to point out two more issues, and the first one is that if you have a strong bud that has long needles on it, and I have an example right here, you don't want to remove all those needles. In other words, you shouldn't just pull off all of the long needles. So anything that wasn't decandled in the middle of summer is going to have longer needles than the points, the foliage that's coming out of points that were decandled. And that means that it's tempting to try to just remove those by plucking them, but you can, if you're not going to show the tree and it doesn't matter whether they have brown tips, you can actually just cut the needles in half in order to give them the same approximate length as the needles that the tree grew on the summer buds. And that's what I've done in a couple of places in here. But what you should avoid doing is just pulling off all of those long needles. And right here I have an example of a bud that has no needles around it. So there's a nice strong bud right here. It's stronger than any of the buds that are in any of these decandled sites. And what that means to me is that this wasn't decandled, and then the person who was working on this tree prior to me was pulling off all of the long needles, and as a result there are no needles on this section. Now chances are it'll still send out shoots next spring from the already formed bud, but what may happen then is if you try to decandle it next summer with no needles around the decandling site, it may just then die back depending on the overall strength of the tree. Now the second thing I want to point out is that you can't do the same type of cutback in the fall that you do in the middle of summer. So you have to leave needles at the cut points that you make during this time of the year. So I can't go back and cut off in the fall just like it was in the middle of summer. If there's a long shoot and I want to cut to the middle of the needles on that shoot, that shoot is not going to bud properly and stay in sync with the rest of the tree the following season, and that's going to cause an issue in terms of being able to even out all of the growth over the entirety of the tree. All right, so that's the process of sort of resetting this tree and compacting the branches to get it on its way towards being a little bit tighter composition again. And you know, it is perfectly normal for bonsai to increase in size slightly as they age, but you don't want them growing an inch in canopy every year. What I've done basically is, you know, bringing these branches down, thinning them out, same thing here and here. And then when we get up into the crown, there's really sort of a balancing act where you're cutting off long branches in favor of shorter ones, and then kind of compacting things by making more sideways movement in order to bring the crown down and sort of save the best, shortest material. It's easier to do work like this where you're actually compacting the crown in the middle of the summer because the tree will react to it immediately, and then you can sort of like see the result and do thinning in the fall afterwards. In the fall, if you haven't done enough cutback during the summer, then usually it'll become a little bit more difficult to do this work where you can actually bring the crown in from being a big wide crown to being something that's more narrow. And one thing I had forgotten about this tree since before I owned it or before I sold it was that I wanted to move the front just slightly. So here's the potted front, but I think that the actual front is just slightly to the left of that, which brings the this low branch a little bit more towards you as the viewer. I've already tilted the tree slightly forward, but I like this new front because it shows a little bit more dimension to the trunk, especially back in here. You can see from that front rather than from the potted front being a little bit more flat feeling, and the tree kind of goes up like that, whereas from slightly like this you get more of the feeling of the tree kind of cascading towards you. And even though it's not like a real cascade, it's more like a slant style tree with a drop branch. It's a nice tree, and hope you guys enjoyed that.